tardes, bienvenidos a Lighthouse de nuevo. Estamos hoy con el doctor Mattihias Ralt. Es para mí un honor presentar a este doctor alemán. Era director del Instituto Paul Linus Pauling y ha hecho dos libros importantes. El primero es Victorias sobre el cáncer, que habla de medicina celular, y el segundo, y para mí fundamental y súper interesante, es el de las raíces nazis de la Unión de Bruselas, donde ahonda sobre temas económicos y políticos, sobre todo de las farmacéuticas.
People think, oh, pharmaceutical industry, these are the guys that provide health. No, no, no. They pretend They pretend to provide health, and their true nature of existence is to make money from the patented products. Second law was that the prevention and elimination of disease is not the primary target of this, or primary interest of this industry, but in fact the maintenance of these diseases and their promotion, even the invention of new diseases, because that is the business they are in. Diseases are their markets, so they need to keep them alive and expand them. Third is they of course cannot say that openly, because people and governments would revolt. So there's about 50 to 60% of the money they spend is in what they call marketing, which is of course the deception to cover what they really do.
It's a lot of power, a lot of money.
A lot of power. And in the lead export nations of pharmaceutical products, there has been a long-standing connection between these corporate interests and government officials and regulatory agencies, and etc., etc. Take, for example, Germany. The entire German nation after World War II, was called West Germany, was created around the chemical pharmaceutical cartel, Bayer, BASF, Höchst. Several chancellors came directly from these companies and were promoted into the highest office, meaning the Chancellor of Germany.
Helmut Kohl
was a lead person, and of course the people around him, Mr. Schäuble, Angela Merkel, are direct offsprings of Helmut Kohl's era. And all areas of German society have been affected by the very nature of the power of these interest groups, and whether that is medicine, a strong connection into the medical schools, what you learn as a medical student, strong connection into the media, a strong connection even in the legal system, so that when you are being attacked as someone who is challenging the pharmaceutical interests, you face an uphill battle, because the pharmaceutical interest is just the common denominator of that society.
Good. Tell me, what do you say in your book? What is it about?
Which book?
The one with the United Europe.
The Nazi roots of the Brussels EU.
What is the connection between these big groups, pharmaceutical, with the politicians and the Nazis in the wars?
Well, first, the people of the world were told about history that there was World War I, and it just happened. Some states, some kings or emperors at that time ended up in some rivalry, and suddenly there was war. Not so. This war was a war of conquest, organized, conceived, strategically planned by pharmaceutical and chemical cartel, namely Bayer, BASF, Höchst, who at that time had the lead in identifying new molecules, reproducing them, patenting them, owning them, and they wanted to export this model to other countries. Now, these other countries, they didn't want to be controlled by them, so they needed to organize a military adventure, military conquest of these countries. And now we understand that the World War I was nothing less than the first attempt of this new industry, the chemical, pharmaceutical concentration of power, to claim the domination of Europe and the world. And then this adventure ended in a defeat, luckily, at the price of millions of people dying. And the German emperor was sent into the exile, and the corporate interest continued and invested in the Nazis. And Bayer, BASF, Höchst, by that time they had formed the IG Farben cartel, that became the largest supporter of the Nazis' rise to power. And at the end of World War II, after the defeat after 1945, there was even a specific trial where 24 managers of IG Farben were tried for the crimes they committed in Nuremberg. But that is just the backdrop of this book. What really triggered me to initiate this project was that we were able to find documents about the key architect of the Brussels EU. Unbeknown to most people, this was a gentleman by the name of Walter Hallstein. Walter Hallstein was a prominent lawyer in Nazi Germany. He was member of a delegation that was sent down by the Hitler regime to Rome to negotiate with the Mussolini lawyers about the future shape of Europe after they had conquered Europe. That was in June 1938, 1.5 years, or 14 months before they started World War II. They knew they would do this, they knew they would launch this war, and they started to think, how are they going to administer this conquered countries? What are the laws, the administrative regulations? And Hallstein was the key person in the German delegation for the new architecture of a Nazi cartel Europe. Luckily that didn't happen, and everyone thought that key people of that nature would actually go to prison or would be sentenced and removed from public office or put away. Not so with Mr. Hallstein. When he was interrogated by what was called the denazification committee of the Allies, there were specific committees set up to make sure that the Nazis could not continue with their philosophy, and when he was interviewed, he lied to them. They had to sign a document indicating whether they were members of Nazi organizations and were promoting that philosophy and stuff like that. And we got hold of that document, and we saw that he was just outright lying. He was member of the most notorious professional organization of the Nazis, which was the Nazi Association of what they called protectors of the law. I mean, the Nazi law, and he was a lead figure for the Nazi state in these negotiations. And he just lied. He just said, well, I'm innocent. And that was his entree into the next life. And he was picked up by the first German Chancellor Adenauer. and they and promoted to the position of the first promoted to the chief negotiator for preparing the Rome treaties, which became in 1957 the first legal foundation of the Brussels EU. And then he was promoted by the West German government to become the first president of the EU Commission. And he was given 8,000 and something bureaucrats, people working under him, only responsible to this one person, to create what we today know as the Brussels EU Europe, including the undemocratic structures that the Brussels the EU Commission was created as an exclusive executive committee responsible to literally no one. That's how it's phrased. Not the people, not the governments, to no one. They have the exclusive right to initiate legislation. Where are we? We're living in the 21st century and everyone thinks we are living in a democracy. It's outright dictatorship there on behalf of corporate interests. And it's fantastically masked by the propaganda that is being made to praise Europe as the model of peace and the model of prosperity, and etc., etc. And it's only now that the crisis that this model initiated, the one-sidedness for the corporate interests in Spain and other countries in Europe, Greece, Italy, Portugal, Ireland, and so on. So pretty soon France and ultimately also Germany. It is only now that this crisis is breaking open that these facts can be traced back to their origin. So in a nutshell, the Hallstein documents were, for me, the main reason to launch this project. I was very happy to have good colleagues working with me. Dr. Nitzwicki, my long-standing colleague from Poland, Paul Taylor, and of course August Kowalczyk, who is a survivor of the Auschwitz concentration camp. And with his support for this book, he of course was adding a lot of authenticity as one of the victims of Auschwitz. Auschwitz being, of course, 100% subsidiary of IG Farben at the time.
And what was it used for, Auschwitz? What were they doing in Auschwitz?
Well, that's another something else that few people know. We've been told that there was the Auschwitz concentration camp, but it was run by crazy SS people, and it was basically a racially motivated concentration and extermination camp, which in fact it was in part. But the reason why it became that factory of death was the decision of IG Farben in 1941 to build what was to become the largest corporate structure outside Germany, wartime Germany. 24 square kilometer size industrial plant to produce synthetic rubber and other war essential synthetic products which they needed for the conquest of Russia and Eastern Europe and Asia ultimately. And IG Auschwitz, this huge plant in the city of Auschwitz, required a lot of slave labor, and so the nearby concentration camp of Auschwitz was turned into a giant slave labor camp. And slave labor, of course, meant at the time that if you were working at the IG Farben construction site of building this monster of synthetic production plant, you were only needed by Bayer, BASF and Höchst as long as you could work. Once you were sick or they had worn you out, there was no health insurance or retirement plan. They were killed, and thousands of them were just killed. It was called extermination through labor. And if you remember that sentence, labor liberates, it was the Nazi speak, or Nazi newspeak, I should say. And if you remember the inscript on the concentration camp of Auschwitz, labor liberates, Arbeit macht frei. It was Nazi newspeak for exactly the opposite. It was killing, extermination through slave labor. And also the experiments, the medical experiments then were not conducted on behalf of the SS. The SS was a troop of murderers. They didn't have the intelligence to create drugs or anything commercially accessible and of any value. They were the guys who executed the commercial interests of Bayer and Höchst, mainly those two companies, who tested their drugs, patented drugs, new drugs, in Auschwitz and Buchenwald and some other smaller concentration camps in order to make them ready for the world market. And now when all that has been part of the Nuremberg War Crime Tribunals, at the time when we started this work, there was nothing, absolutely nothing about the tribunal from Nuremberg on the web, the tribunal from Nuremberg against IG Farben, against Bayer, BASF and Höchst, on the web. In fact, there were no books, it wasn't in printed form available either. And I got curious, I said, well, how much money do you need to spend from these companies to cover your past? Not just in the newspapers, but also in books, in the history books, in everything our children are being taught in school about the origin of World War II. And so we, our foundation, went ahead and we found quite some documents in national archives about this trial, and we published by now about 50,000 of these records on Profit Over Life online, and there's no way that the current understanding of World War II by the general public, that it was a racially motivated war, can be upheld. There's no way. It was the second attempt of the chemical pharmaceutical cartel from Germany at a world conquest based on 40,000 patents or what they had at the time, trying to impose that economic money printing machine on the world.
Do you think it might be a third attempt to do it?
Yeah, obviously what we see today is, now going back to 1945, again what we saw is that the political and the military puppets were sentenced in Nuremberg to death or to lifetime in prison, and rightly so. But the puppeteers, the guys who actually planned this war and made it possible and hired the Nazis to implement it, they were sentenced with a few years, like for example the CEO, the chief executive of Bayer, Termier, was sentenced to 7 years in prison in 1948. In 1956, 8 years later, he was not only out of prison, he was back as the chairman of the board of Bayer again. Now, what do we learn from that? We learn from it that the interest groups had a certain continuity. And that was in 1956, exactly the year when the final documents on the Brussels EU were signed. When the German government, with Bayer being its corporate flagship, became the driving force of this Brussels EU. And you can see that by the mid-50s, meaning 10 years after their second attempt failed, they were back in business, and they were right at it to create the third attempt, this time without military component, but by means of a heinous strategy of economic strangulation and of political coercion. At that time, 60, 70 years ago now, they knew that the day would come that Spain is in this crisis that that is today, that Italy will soon be there, that Greece is in this. They knew that at that time. And that was their target, that was their goal, predetermined goal.
It's all planned.
Excuse me?
It's all planned.
Yeah, it was all planned. And you will see that in a few days, there will be some politicians meeting in Brussels or Strasbourg and saying, oh, we should take advantage of this crisis and unite and make a political union out of Europe, or the United States of Europe. And so, shall we say, 7 decades after their second attempt failed, they reached their ultimate goal, almost. Meaning that they create a body in Europe that rules every part of life, not democratically. You cannot elect them, you cannot throw them out of office. They are there to control you and your life. With the Brussels EU, yeah. So the Brussels EU, the construct of the Brussels EU is the third attempt. And they never came that close. I mean, some people say, oh, you know, the Nazis were ruthless destroyers they were just there to destroy everything. It's a crazy thought. They were ruthless, they were criminals, and there's nothing better to say about them. They deserved every punishment in the world, but they were hired because of their ruthlessness by these corporate interests. And the interests of these corporate interests, they were not interested in destruction. They were interested in making one thing, money, and controlling that, and controlling the markets, and turning Europe into a platform to conquer the world. And this is where they are now. If you see the Brussels EU envoys flying to Africa and saying, hey, African Union, you need to model your continental government according to the Brussels EU. And suddenly you have a commission of the African Union. And they go to South America, to the Mercosur, and they go to Southeast Asia, to the ASEAN states, and they sell their model as the future of, I don't know what, of an Orwellian world, or what? Probably.
One world order.
One world order, yeah. And they know they cannot accomplish that in one sweep, so their plan is to do it with those regional, continental takeovers, exporting the undemocratic Brussels model to other continents, and then ultimately uniting it under one umbrella, obviously.
Many of the immigrants who have flooded into Europe came through Turkey. And now immigration from the Islamic world is causing a political earthquake in Europe and threatens the political future of its chief architect, German Chancellor Angela Merkel. Dale Hurd reports that the rebellion against the European Union's immigration policy is spreading.
Almost half of Germans now want Chancellor Angela Merkel to resign. Her coalition government could collapse if she doesn't get the right EU agreement restricting the number of migrants entering Germany. President Trump tweeted that the people of Germany are turning against their leadership over migration. Trump was mocked for also tweeting that Germany's crime rate is up, although official figures show it's at a 30-year low. But violent crime in Germany is up, and it's because of migrants. 1,000 Europeans have now been injured or killed in terrorist attacks involving migrants since 2014. And Germany has been targeted with terror plots more than any other European nation, by a wide margin. The rebellion against the European Union's migrant policy has now spread to Italy. Italy's new interior minister says, if someone in Europe thinks that Italy should continue to be a landing point and a refugee camp, they are mistaken. 4 of the immigration rebels, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, and Poland, refused to participate in the EU summit on migration. The rebellion has also spread to the grassroots in Sweden, where one poll shows the anti-immigration Sweden Democrats with a clear lead heading towards September elections, with some asking if Sweden is about to have its Trump moment.
Sweden's refugee policy has imported crime, terrorism, and a lot of refugees that experts say are uneducated and unemployable.
Swedish security expert Magnus Norell.
If you live in Stockholm, in certain areas of Stockholm, you never see this. You don't have to see this. But in smaller communities, in smaller cities, you can't avoid it. And there is where the change will come.
And change is coming to a number of nations in Europe.